Fantastic. Thanks very much. And a big welcome everyone to our peer learning group session on value in public finance. I'm Elaine de Gruyter and I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the Government Outcomes Lab at the University of Oxford. And it's a pleasure to be chairing this session with Jeffrey Matsu, Chief Economist at the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, and also one of our Fellows of Practice here at the Government Outcomes Lab at the University of Oxford. I'm pleased to introduce today's topic, which is maximising value for money, different approaches, same objective. So a bit of context in that value for money, the value for money assessments is a critical process that organisations undertake to determine whether the benefits of a project justify its costs. While the objective seems crystal clear, in practice there are a myriad of approaches due to differences in context, data, resource, and many other factors. So today's session will feature 3 presentations on innovative approaches and recent case studies. And our first speaker will be Jeff, who will present on case studies on smarter public spending from the London Borough of Redbridge and the Thames Valley Violence Reduction Unit. I will then present on the GoLab's recent work examining the value for money of a traditional fee-for-service contract in comparison to a social outcomes partnership. And our third speaker, who it is a real pleasure to introduce to you today, or should I say in his evening, it's 7 p.m. Melbourne time at the moment, is Matt Donoghue, who is a Director of Early Intervention and Reform at the Department of Treasury and Finance in Victoria, Australia, who will present on the department's innovative framework aiming to maximise value for money by improving outcomes while also reducing growth in government expenditure. So just a couple of housekeeping notes. Each presentation will be a brief 10 to 12 minute presentation to ensure that we have plenty of time for discussion. The aim is to be as interactive as possible, so please don't be shy and please don't hold back in your questions. And we have allocated around 20 minutes for discussion at the very end. Please also feel free to put any points of discussion or comments in the chat, and I'll also be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation. If you do have any critical pressing questions that is needed during the presentation, we could potentially take a couple of key questions between presentations, but my preference is to leave the bulk of the discussion at the end. And just to note that we will be recording this session, but we will not be recording the Q&A. And a reminder to also mute your microphones, which I can see most people have done, so thank you very much. Big thanks also to my colleague at the GoLab, Jess Reedy, for all your help with support and logistics and Zoom operations tonight. So any issues with the logistics, please touch base with Jeff. But I will hand over to Jeff to get us started. Thanks very much, Jeff.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Elaine, for that introduction. Welcome to everyone who is either has been part of this peer learning group. We kicked off, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, and we've been having periodic sessions on different aspects of what good management of public finances across various geographic scales of public finance looks like. So that's looking at local, regional, national, and international domains as well. So in my session, we're going to be looking at how public bodies can maximize value for money, not just as an accounting exercise, but as a way to shape better decisions. We'll explore 2 case studies. One is from Redbridge Council, which applied the VFM toolkit that we co-developed, we being SIPFA and the Government Outcomes Lab. That is available on the GoLab website. I think under the tools, if you just type VFM toolkit, you'll be able to access it. It's a free-to-air toolkit with full guidance notes. So I encourage any of you who after this presentation are interested in learning more or trying it for yourself to go to the GoLab website. And then the other second case study is the Thames Valley Violence Reduction Unit, which trialed a VFM lifecycle approach, which shares similar conceptual frameworks as the toolkit, but takes it from a much more holistic approach, and I'll explain in a bit more detail in a minute. Both of these case studies show practical ways to bring the concept of value for money to life, and both offer lessons that practitioners and policymakers can apply immediately. So in my first slide, just to kind of give a broad macro framework of how VFM is thought through here in the UK, we have two sort of frameworks. One is the Green Book, which is outlines best practices for it's the previous slide on the screen. Yeah, that one. Yes. So these are two of the main guidance notes that we have, our guidance frameworks we have here in the UK. The Green Book kind of is really focused on appraisal and evaluation and how projects and programs should be submitted to government for funding in a very structured way. Um, The guidance is crucial in the planning and pre-implementation stages, helping decision makers assess the potential benefits, costs, and uncertainties of proposed initiatives. Of course, this needs to bridge to evaluation. And so oftentimes we sort of have either good appraisal or good evaluation, but not kind of connecting the two. And so this is where the two case studies I'll be talking about kind of try to do that of not just setting up things, but also making sure that during the life cycle of an intervention, we're able then to kind of monitor and then ultimately evaluate once it's been completed. On the next slide, this is just a bird's eye view of that pathway, that life cycle of how, when we think about value, it needs to go through these key buckets. And so, for anyone who's kind of been in the space of project assessment, these are fairly straightforward things that will sort of guide the case studies that I present. So in the next slide, why does VFM matter? It matters a lot just because we all know that governments, particularly here in the UK now, don't have a lot of fiscal headroom. And so we need to do more with less. And one way of doing that is understanding not just gaining greater efficiencies in how government spending is being conducted, but also making sure that through that spending, the outcomes are clear at the beginning and that we're making sure that if they're not being delivered, we kind of understand and feed that through the thought process of the next round of interventions and spending commitments. So in the next slide, I have the first case, which is that of Redbridge Council. So this is one of the numerous local authorities here in England. Um, and there's over 300 of them. But this is one that's in one of the London boroughs. And it was quite an organic process in which they decided to adopt the VFM toolkit. And I share this context because I think it's really important. There is a story behind why practitioners decide to change their business as usual approach. And in the case of Redbridge, they had come to us after we had published the toolkit, wanting to know more because they were struggling in not getting some of their new and more innovative projects and programs funded. Why is that? Well, when funding is tight, and I said in the UK, there's not a lot of fiscal headroom, there was a strong inclination towards risk aversion. And so many councils were, um, in some cases, unwilling, but in many cases, they had a preference it was easier to fail doing things in a conventional way than it was to fail at doing something that was innovative and being blamed for it when there's not that much additional money floating around in a council's budget. And so they wanted a way to better evidence in an objective way why they were proposing to senior management within the council that these types of interventions were worthwhile. And so by using the toolkit, which was very structured, they were able to adopt the UK National Audit Office's 4 E's framework, which is the economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and equity. And many times the focus is um, largely lands on the economy and efficiency elements. And that's something that they wanted to pivot away from. Um, so what's interesting is that they were trying to change the way culture was the culture of putting forward project proposals was done within the council, and that was through a very much more objective numeric way. In the next slide, um, we have sort of the theory of change, and this is just a very stylized diagram of how councils generally, but more particularly within our VFM toolkit, approaches measurement. And it's going through these different pathways and loops that um, allowed Redbridge to sort of benchmark some of the interventions they were trying. And in this particular case, I'm focusing much more on the high level framework rather than the specific interventions, specifically because some of that information is not in the public domain. And so we know that of the 7 projects that they ran through the VFM toolkit itself, 6 of them actually were funded. And they kind of fed back to us and said, um, without the toolkit, they would have suspected most, if not all, of those proposals to have not been funded. So there is a big impact that is brought forth by going through this type of theory of change and going through the structure that the toolkit provides. I don't have an actual screenshot of the toolkit itself, but as I said, it's on the GoLab website. So if you go through there, you will have a very clear understanding. And if you fast forward 2 slides, please. This table shows the 6 worksheets that comprise the toolkit itself. And so we tried to simplify it in a way where practitioners without specialist knowledge or training in VFM can readily input data. A lot of the data is self-defined, so there isn't any right or wrong answer, but it is guided through the guidance note as to what is appropriate, and then it needs to kind of be iterated through partners within the organization. The second example is around the Thames Valley VRU, and they had done a very different approach. Um, looking, and sorry, if you could go to the next slide, please. Um, I'm not seeing the slides advancing, but the instead of a one-off appraisal tool, the VRU decided to adopt what they designed as a 5-stage pipeline that runs through the entire life cycle of a program, from early scoping through design and delivery and onto evaluation. And so they take this bird's eye high-level view of, and I did have a diagram that showed the gateways, there you go, of how from before they actually initiate an intervention, they go through these 5 gates, which are at the bottom of the screen on the yellow boxes. And this informs whether or not they will initiate the project. The strength here is in linking evidence and finance. Impact evaluation data on effectiveness is paired with cost assessments. So decision makers can see not just whether something works, but whether it's cost effective over time. And so that's where they have these 5 yellow boxes or the gates. And practitioners told us it was especially useful for baseline setting and long-term planning. When you're working in crime prevention, which is the violence reduction units sector, you need to know whether early interventions will really reduce costs later on. And this life cycle approach gives you a way to track that. For policymakers, the big hook is sustainability of funding, being able to demonstrate long-term cost effectiveness which strengthens the case for continued investment, especially when budgets are under pressure. So the key lessons, as you can see, um, if you that there needs to be a holistic approach that can be applied to different sectors across different spatial scales. And that is something that the life cycle approach was designed to address. In terms of cross-cutting takeaways across the two examples, um, on the next slide, please. This is just like a summary of what we can draw from these two practical cases. And the key recommendations are making tools more usable and accessible, so they slot into existing processes with minimal extra effort. In the case of these two examples with the VFM Toolkit and the VRU, they align with Treasury's Green Book and Magenta books, which I started off with, and that ensures consistency across the public sector, so speaking that common language. They promote knowledge sharing and peer learning amongst practitioners. So in both of these cases, and the reason why we developed the case study was to understand good practice and also to understand and share the challenges. And we kind of worked through those examples in a recent report we co-published a couple months ago. And then finally, the continuously refining the frameworks based on user feedback and policy needs. And so that is the point of the peer learning group today. So I'll stop here and I'll pass it back to Elaine.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I'll just wait for my slides to pop up. Thanks, Jess. Fantastic. Thanks, Jess. So my presentation is going to be covering some recent research that we undertook at the GoLab on commissioning social services through a traditional fee-for-service contract or social outcomes partnership. So which one of these is better value for money? Next slide, please, Jess. So we use a case study of the Kirklees Better Outcomes Partnership, which I'll refer to as KBOP. So KBOP is one of the Life Chances Fund projects in the UK. So for those of you who aren't in the UK, the Life Chances Fund is a £70 million outcomes fund from the UK Government Civil Society Directorate, comprising 29 different social outcomes partnership projects, also known as social impact bonds elsewhere or outcomes-based contracts. So the aim of KBOP is to secure better outcomes for disadvantaged Kirklees residents experiencing multiple and complex disadvantage through the provision of housing-related support. So there was a focus on supporting those at risk of homelessness or those who were homeless. Before 2019, which I'll refer to as pre-KBOP, Kirklees Council or the local government commissioned ad hoc housing support services by non-profit provider organisations under fee-for-service contracts. But from 2019 onwards, which I'll call KBOP, Kirklees Council introduced a social outcomes partnership backed by social investors where payment is linked to outcomes achieved. Next slide, please, Jess. So our evaluation comprised two key components, and we had some funding to undertake the evaluation from UK Treasury's Labour Markets Evaluation Pilot Fund. So our evaluation comprised two key components. So the first component was the impact evaluation. So here we sought to examine what are the impacts achieved under KBOP compared to pre-KBOP. The second component of the evaluation sought to understand, does KBOP represent value for money compared to pre-KBOP? And our focus of today's presentation is on that second component of the evaluation. As part of our work on the Labour Markets Evaluation Pilot Fund, we were given access to a unique data set. So this enabled us to understand the impacts of individual program participants under pre-KBOP and KBOP. And enabled us to link this individual program participants with their UK government administrative data. So for example, if there's a person called John Brown who participated under pre-KBOP, The pre-KBOP non-profit social service providers were able to provide us with his name, his date of birth, his national insurance number, and with those unique identifiers, we were able to match John Brown's records with his UK government administrative records. So this enabled us to understand John Brown's benefits history, so what he'd claimed in the past and what he was currently claiming, his previous labour market history, as well as his current labour market status, as well as his history of housing benefits and whether or not he was currently claiming any housing support, as well as information on his demographics, such as how many children he had, gender and age, etc. Next slide, please, Jess. So our impact evaluation, and I can see my brilliant colleague here, Maria, on the chat, who I undertook this work with. The impact evaluation found some better employment and housing outcomes under KBOP relative to pre-KBOP. But the question that we ask here is whether KBOP actually represents value for money. So in theory, this should be straightforward to answer because we have impact estimates from the impact evaluation, and presumably organisations hold good cost data. However, in practice, this can be tricky and we had to make a number of key considerations. Next slide, please, Jess. So firstly, there are a number of ways in which you can undertake a value for money assessment, but in this case, we adopted a cost effectiveness analysis because our impacts are in different units. So we have a combination of monetary units, so that is earnings, and non-monetary units, so that is time and employment and housing benefit receipts. We also had to make a number of key considerations around the analysis. So the first was a need to align costs with impacts. So we therefore had to construct pre-KBOP and KBOP groups slightly differently to the impact evaluation. We also had very different sample sizes between pre-KBOP and KBOP. So we had to standardise units and in order to consider things at the per person level to ensure that we were able to compare like with like. We were limited in our ability to access broader data, and UK government guidelines, as well as other international government guidelines, recommend that you undertake a value for money assessment at the societal level. However, given our limited access to that broader societal data, we had to undertake our cost effectiveness analysis from a limited government perspective, which the academic literature supports is a common way to undertake the analysis in these instances of data issues. We also wanted to be informative for future practice. So KBOP was new, the Life Chances Fund was relatively new for the UK, so we wanted to therefore understand how much of the costs are attributable to a new versus a future project. So we therefore undertook sensitivity analysis to test various scenarios. Next slide, please. Thanks, Jess. So this is a cost assessment framework that we developed. So we defined three key cost categories as part of that. And our cost category definitions are developed according to activity type. So the first key cost category there, we've got intervention and service costs. And this was fairly straightforward to collate from pre-KBOP contract values as well as KBOP commissioner payments. The second cost category we've got there are transaction costs. So we use the definition in Peterson et al. And define transaction costs as all of those costs associated with setting up a contract. So that is the time to search for organisations, signing, negotiation, legal fees, development costs, etc. And also all of the costs associated after the contract has been set up. So all of those costs associated with implementation, such as governance, evaluation and monitoring. So social outcomes partnerships often get a bad rap for being really expensive, but nobody's actually sat down to estimate what those transaction costs actually are. So we sought to estimate the transaction costs here by undertaking semi-structured interviews with local government and central government stakeholders. And we also use these interviews as a way to determine whether there were any other costs incurred that were not captured in the first two cost categories. Thanks, Jess. So these are the total costs associated with pre-KBOP and KBOP. So all of these costs are reported in real 2024 pounds. So all have been adjusted for inflation. And the first graph on the left-hand side, you can see that KBOP costs more. So the total cost for KBOP is £23.3 million compared to £17.8 million for pre-KBOP. So you can see that KBOP has both higher intervention and service costs and also higher transaction costs. Zooming in on those orange transaction costs, we come across to the graph on the right-hand side, where you can see under pre-KBOP, the sole source of transaction costs came from local government, so Kirklees Council. Under KBOP, local government costs slightly reduced, but we now have two new cost categories. So we now have central government costs and also evaluation costs. But one important thing to note is that KBOP actually had a higher number of participants than pre-KBOP, so almost double the number of participants. So when you consider things at the per person level, the KBOP cost per person was around 33% lower, so £3,236 per person compared to £4,856. Thanks, Jess. So is KBOP value for money? Well, yes, we find that KBOP is less costly and more effective than pre-KBOP across all outcomes. For those of you who want the detail, I do have the incremental cost effectiveness ratios spelled out in the tables there. But for those of you who want some interpretation on what some of those numbers mean, the incremental cost effectiveness ratio for earnings per person is minus 0.46, which means that for every additional £1 of earnings per person, KBOP costs 46p per person less. For every additional month of employment per person, KBOP costs £639 per person less. And for every additional reduction in month-on housing-related benefits, KBOP costs £510 per person less. And these results are driven by the higher number of participants under KBOP and also the improved effects, and this is despite KBOP's greater transaction costs. Next slide, please, Jess, and this is my final slide. So I guess there are a number of things to point out and highlight, and our analysis also was associated with a few limitations. So firstly, KBOP and pre-KBOP had different areas of focus. So just to point out that pre-KBOP had a core focus on housing. However, KBOP was more holistic, so also focused on other outcomes such as employment, education, financial literacy, wellbeing, volunteering. So they had a more holistic approach compared to pre-KBOP. There are also very different definitions of success. So our effects in our analysis are driven by the variables that we could access in the Department for Work and Pensions administrative data, whereas KBOP had a broader definition of success. So for them, they define success in terms of, just getting someone out of the house, dog walking, not being paid, dog walking for maybe half an hour every week. And for them, that was a really important step for people taking first steps into perhaps longer term employment, but getting people out of that mode of getting them out of the house and getting used to that kind of schedule and employment. So we were unable to pick up these sorts of instances with the administrative data. Our analysis was associated with a number of limitations. So we had a limited data on impacts, so only 3 years for the KBOP data. We are also unable to account for differences in economic and labour market conditions during the different time periods. And our incremental cost effectiveness ratio is estimated from aggregate costs, so we haven't attempted to apportion it to each outcome or individual. And I should also just add before I pass on to Matt that I did actually run this cost effectiveness analysis through the VFM toolkit that Jeff was just mentioning before, and the results, I'm pleased to say, point to the same findings that KBOP is better value for money than pre-KBOP. Thanks very much. I'll hand over to Matt now.
Thanks, Elaine, and thanks, Jess, for driving the slides. Might start with just thanks to GoLab for having me tonight. And our team isn't here, but it's not just me. There's a wonderful team behind these set of slides to highlight that, and also a lot of stakeholders that have given us feedback that have led to its design over the years too. So I might kick off from there. I might quickly give an acknowledgement of the traditional owners on which I'm speaking from and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. First People have a special place in this program. I think there's a lot of the programs that are funded through the framework focus on first people's cohorts and building the evidence base, and also increasingly getting programs that we can track that are effective and increasingly more effective is certainly part of the framework. So I just acknowledge that as well. So I'll give you a quick summary of what I'll speak to, and then I'll start going through it. So a couple of slides down, I'll start with a bit of a background genesis of where the framework came from, its focus on outcomes, a very high level of how it's applied in the budget, and then some lessons and resources for you to have a look at in your time and leisure if that's useful. Move to the next slide, please. So Treasury delivers this framework for government. It's government's framework, and this has been doing so for up about 6 years now, coming towards its sixth budget. Initially, government came to Treasury with the problem that gross and acute expenditure is outpacing government revenue. Also, despite everyone saying, and the literature saying, early intervention, upstream investments are great, it still makes up only a small share of government funding. We've learned lessons from social impact bonds in Victoria, and I see one of our stakeholder partners on the call, definitely an expert. Very happy to see her here. And also clear feedback, and maybe it was from this stakeholder as well, but having a successful pathway for those programs that can build the evidence that they work, that didn't seem to exist beforehand. And with that, so the framework was developed and sort of had some objectives in mind. Next slide, please. First and foremost, more timely help for people before their needs became more severe. Secondly, to arrest the fiscal impacts of unsustainable expenditure on demand and repeating the cycle again. And then over time, a more balanced system. What's perhaps sitting underneath that is also the hypothesis that having better evidence will lead to better decision making. And that sort of comes through. So where do we start? We focus on evidence. So as an economist, the framework, the next slide will talk to you about a bit of an example overview of what the framework tries to do, and tries to quantify two things. It attempts to quantify outcomes or client impacts from a program that allow us to assess and track effectiveness on an annual basis, and also to look at the system impacts or the secondary impacts in terms of avoided costs on the social system as well, noting that a lot of solutions to social problems aren't just in Department of Health or Department of Human Service or Department of Education, but they have flow-on impacts where a proposal in the Department of Housing or may have flow on to the Justice Department and to health, and as well as just the housing. So really, otherwise, it's just those two requirements. Otherwise, it's integrated within existing budget process, and everything else is the same as normal budget, but it requires that quantification of client impact, quantification of avoided costs. And through the building of that evidence and that tracking, it does and has provided a scale up and a scale down pathway for proposals, the ones that are working scale up, the ones with that aren't working as effectively as planned leads to further conversations, which sometimes can mean scaling down, and also allows us to use a lot of the risk management tools already in place through the budget as well. Next slide, please. So how does it work? I think whenever we have discussions around a new proposal coming through the budget and through the e-framework, it starts with a question: how does it work? So what is the client group that is seeking support from this new program? How does the program work? Theory of change, in other words. And then how does it flow on to affecting acute services? And then the modelling falls out of that. And that's the same pathway. How is this going to help a client? And obviously that's supported by better evidence. Will give you a better answer to that question. A clearer sense of priority and an objective in it from the outset was also helpful. But also there are some programs that are pilots that are growing the evidence base over time, and there's some flexibility in the to capture reporting on a few of those outcomes until you found exactly what the program is doing. So there's some flexibility built in. The next slide goes on a little bit further. This is an example of some of those measures and what they might look like. I talked about outcome measures. So for these measures, each program that's funded through EIF has up to 6 measures that it can choose from. Usually it's a mixture of client outcomes and system outcomes. And that allows for the tracking of effectiveness over time. Some of this you would get in a sort of standard lapsing program or end of or summative evaluation, but this gives government it annually to see how things are tracking, which gives a bit more oversight, and also tells a story of how a program is impacting the client, not just the output, but how it's impacting in terms of outcomes. The other aspect is, next slide, around avoided costs. So there's a couple of models in Victoria that we've used. The Treasury's built its own. There's also another whole of government simulation model that we use now as well, which we're hoping to all get onto the same model to estimate those system impacts. This was definitely a capability built requirement and building, and has built up over time. Certainly, I think initially Treasury did around 90% of the modelling in the first year of EIF, and increasingly departments themselves have increased that capability. So it's closer to 50-50 in the latest budget as well. The avoided cost trajectories on the right-hand side will vary depending on the nature of the program. More programs that are closer to the downstream end are likely going to be front-ended with more acute cohorts, and then the top graph more reflects sort of education initiatives and things more on the further upstream where the benefits might be 10, 15, 20 years, or hopefully 5-10 years. So we can measure them. As mentioned, it's embedded in government process. A lot more slides is my favorite part, but I have picked out the favorite slides. One of the things that is on the next slide is a bubble diagram. It sort of represents the ranking of proposals on one graph, and this has allowed us to be really clear with stakeholders from the start about how Treasury will rank proposals, and it's by how high is the impact and what's the strength of the evidence supporting that impact. And that's been consistent since day one. One of the things that it does allow us in the budget process to rank proposals across portfolios, which provides government a sort of a common medium for which they can make assessments and inform their decision making. In short, the further away you are from the origin, the higher impact the proposal. Happy to talk a bit more about that, but that's consistent, and that's, I think, it is a clear message for better evidence, better impact, more likely to get Treasury and support. Next slide, please. Another aspect of building the evidence base is getting and integrating, but is getting the incentives right. I think that generally when you're submitting a budget bid, if your benefits or proposed benefits are too low, you might not get funded. If they're too high, they might not be credible. I think some of the concern around evidence initially that came across when the e-framework was being developed was this evidence isn't strong enough and some of these aren't credible, and which probably was to the detriment of some of the really well-developed proposals that were just sitting on the shelf when we got on the scene a little bit. Beyond just the normal budget incentives, though, there is a reward mechanism, a reinvest to reinvest model within the e-framework that rewards departments that generate the savings by returning those savings for more investments in early interventions and prevention initiatives. This creates not just a one-off budget event, but an ongoing link between budgets, with funding set aside for the next budget to keep investing in early interventions. And that ongoing link also means there's a feedback loop for the finances, but also on that outcomes reporting that's released every year. And you can and there's a feedback loop there that shows stakeholders how all the programs are doing across government too. Next slide, please. So what does this look like over 5-6 years? It started small, didn't happen all at once. The key parameters of the framework were set up front and provide consistency to stakeholders since then, but refinements have been made. The program has grown as government and stakeholders have become more comfortable with the framework. It's become more transparent over time. So initially, we just set up outcomes and the financial incentives. Then the methodologies around avoided costs got landed and have improved upon since. There was an introduction of economic benefits outside of just the fiscal benefits in our estimations. Also, a couple of years ago, government was supportive of publishing at the initiative level what might be described as a benefit cost analysis, which is, for our jurisdiction, wasn't something we'd seen a lot of since, but that's a good step forward in transparency. And more recently, there's been some additional sub-programs that have been developed that help build capability in the sector, but also encourage more co-design and co-development with providers and experts. So lessons for the future, I am wrapping up, but there's a couple of, there's the next slides. I had a look at the objectives, and it's always good to come back. What were the objectives, how to go? So has it provided more timely help for the individuals that are, that these programs are supported? So from the actual information we've received around, yeah, generally it is. For those that are reporting on the interventions, around 80% of them are showing that reporting they're being effective. Secondly, has it put downward pressure on those on the fiscal expenditure for acute? It has, where savings have been realised since the introduction of the framework. Also, the final part is around scale and balance of the system, and growth in early intervention or upstream investments has been substantial. It was close to 1% when the framework started. It does fluctuate, but it's closer to between 5 and 10 now, depending on any given budget, which sounds significant. I think there is a broader context that compared to the base of acute spending, that's still quite small, but which in this jurisdiction, give you a sense of scale, is probably around 40 to 50 billion a year, versus this probably equates to about, on average, 0.51 billion a year. So it's quite small, it's still a small proportion, but it is growing, and that's a positive trajectory. There's a toolkit for those in other jurisdictions that I'll just quickly speak to now. I think the key message from this slide is when designing the framework, whereas a lot of thought process around root cause, why isn't this going to work in 2 years? Why isn't this framework going to be here in 5 years? And that early thinking about why isn't root cause analysis around or failure analysis was really part of it. We have developed a bit of a toolkit that we put online that I encourage you to access to, but it takes through a focus on stakeholders, driving a cultural shift within government, some of the underlying evidence and economics, as well as the financial incentives in a bit more detail. And I'll just wrap up with some more free-flowing lessons. I think the top 3 were definitely things we thought would occur. So it needed to be useful for decision makers. Like if it wasn't influencing budget decisions, I think the framework wouldn't be where it is now. I think there was also a humbleness, and I mentioned on the stakeholders on the call, but also Treasury didn't know all the answers. We knew that. We're economists, we're accountants, we had that knowledge, but we also are open to building research partnerships and listening and consulting with our service providers. And that was really crucial from the outset. And part of that, building that trust with stakeholders, was feedback loops, both in terms of the reporting and the construct, but also when we wrote research or we worked with someone, we've had as a value, as a culture, looping back on how to go, as much as we can within the government, saying this is where it is, and trying to publish as much of that co-contributed work as we can. And the last point is probably just managing expectations a little bit, but the patience to pregnant, if you're starting reporting in some instances, that is good, and that is better than where the base is. And then there's other programs that it will be at are already excellent. I'm doing a lot of this reporting that can leverage this framework, but I think every program, every department, every program is on a different journey. So just being patient with everyone and saying it is going to get better over time, and more evidence is better than less evidence. Yeah, that's it for me. Hopefully some good questions, but thank you again, Elaine and Jeff, and really thanks to the Go Lab. I think whenever I've spoken to, this is particularly true of Elaine, and I've learned something when I've spoken to them, and I've also learned that I need to learn more, which is always a nice thing to have. So thank you, everyone.